I want to tell you a story about how the people who share your blood in your bed can become the very ones who want to bury you while you're still breathing. I've spent 30 years building things meant to last, skyscrapers that touch the Iowa clouds, bridges that defy the river, and a family I thought was anchored in stone. But I never realized that while I was busy pouring the concrete for our future, the two people I trusted most were digging a hole just big enough for my casket. Before we begin, please share in the comments which city or country you're listening from. It helps me know who is standing with me today. My hands are not the hands of a businessman, though I own the largest construction firm in the county. My hands are like oak bark, scarred, thick, and permanently stained with the ghost of red dust and grease. I'm 58 years old, and every one of those years is etched into my knuckles. I started with one rusted truck and a bag of tools I inherited from a father who taught me that a man's word is his only true currency. By the time I hit 50, I had a fleet of 60 trucks and a reputation that was ironclad. My wife, let's call her Sarah, was the velvet to my sandpaper. We'd been married for 26 years. She was the one who picked out the silk ties I hated, the one who organized the charity galas where I felt like a bear in a tuxedo. She always told me, "You build the world, honey, and I'll make sure it looks beautiful." I believed her. I loved her with the kind of quiet, steady devotion that doesn't need to shout. And then there was my brother, Mark, 5 years younger, always faster with a joke and better with a spreadsheet. I brought him into the company when he was 22 and drowning in debt. I made him my vice president. I gave him a seat at the table he hadn't earned because that's what brothers do. You don't let your own blood swim in the dark. But 3 months ago, the world stopped turning. It happened at the Miller Heights site, a freak accident. A support beam gave way during a routine inspection. I remember the sound most of all, a high-pitched groan of metal, like the earth itself was screaming, and then the sudden, heavy silence of the dark. I fell 20 feet. When they pulled me out from under the debris, my left leg was shattered, and my head felt like it had been cracked open like a walnut. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital, 6 weeks watching the fluorescent lights flicker and listening to the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Sarah was there every day, holding my hand, her eyes red from crying. Mark was there too, patting my shoulder, telling me, "Don't worry about the business, big brother. I've got the wheel. You just heal." When I finally came home to our house in West Des Moines, a limestone mansion I'd built with my own crew, I was a different man. I walked with a heavy limp, my cane clicking against the Italian marble floors. But more than the physical pain, there was the fog. The doctors said it was a grade 3 concussion. I had moments where words slipped away from, where I'd stare at a blueprint and the lines would blur into a meaningless tangle of ink. Sarah became my shadow. She handled my medication, bringing me a little plastic cup of pills every morning with a glass of water and a kiss on the forehead. "For the swelling, honey," she'd say, "to help you stay calm." I felt grateful. I felt lucky. I felt like the most cared-for man on earth until the morning of the rainstorm. It was a Tuesday. Sarah had gone to her bridge club, and Mark was supposedly at the office. The house was quiet, that heavy, oppressive silence that only exists in rooms too large for the people living in them. I was in my study, trying to read a contract, but the fog was thick that day. My head throbbed, and my vision felt like I was looking through a dirty window. I realized I needed my old passport for a tax filing Mark had asked about. I remembered I'd tucked it into the small floor safe in the basement, hidden behind a pallet of vintage wine Sarah had bought for an anniversary we never celebrated. I made my way downstairs, my cane thumping rhythmically on the stairs. Thump, drag, thump, drag. The basement smelled of damp concrete and expensive oak. I reached the safe, gritting my teeth as I knelt on my good knee. My fingers moved over the dial by muscle memory. Left to 42, right to 18, left to 9. The heavy steel door swung open with a soft mechanical sigh. I moved the passports aside, looking for the blue folder, but my hand brushed against something else. A thick manila envelope, crisp and new. There was no label on it, just a date from 2 weeks ago. I shouldn't have opened it. A part of me, That old instinctual part that knows when a structure is about to collapse told me to close the safe and walk away, but I opened it. The first thing I saw was my own name, then the word petition. I sat there on the cold basement floor, the dampness seeping into my bones, and I read the words that erased my existence. It was a legal filing for involuntary guardianship and conservatorship. My own wife and my own brother had filed a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent. I turned the pages, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. There were affidavits, one from Sarah, claiming that I had become prone to violent outbursts and unable to recognize my own surroundings. Another from Mark, stating that I had mismanaged company funds and shown signs of early-onset dementia following the accident. But it was the third document that made the room tilt. It was a medical evaluation signed by a doctor I'd seen only twice. It described me as permanently cognitively impaired, a man who could no longer make his own decisions about his health, his money, or his life. There were signatures, Sarah's elegant, loopy script, Mark's sharp, aggressive scrawl. They weren't waiting for me to get better. They were making sure I never did. I looked at the date on the final page. The hearing was scheduled for next month. They had already moved the majority of my personal liquid assets into a temporary holding account, managed jointly by the two of them. They had stripped the house of its value, refinanced the company headquarters, and were preparing to sell the firm to our biggest competitor, a man I'd spent 20 years fighting. I sat there in the dark, the manila envelope shaking in my hand. Suddenly, the fog in my brain didn't feel like a medical condition. It felt like a chemical one. I thought about the little plastic cup Sarah brought me every morning. I thought about the way I felt after taking those pills, lethargic, confused, unable to string a sentence together. I looked up at the ceiling. I heard the front door open upstairs, the light click of Sarah's heels on the marble. "Honey, are you awake?" Her voice drifted down the stairs, sweet as poisoned honey. "It's time for your afternoon rest." I shoved the papers back into the envelope, tucked them under the passports, and slammed the safe shut. I barely made it to the shadows of the wine racks before she reached the bottom of the stairs. "There you are," she said, peering into the dim light. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater. She looked like an angel of mercy. "What are you doing down here in the dark? You know the stairs are dangerous for you." "Just looking for a bottle," I managed to say. My voice sounded thick, like it was buried under sand. She walked over, her hand reaching out to steady me. Her touch, which used to be my anchor, now felt like a shackle. "Oh, sweetheart, you're so confused. We don't keep the wine you like down here anymore. Don't you remember? We moved it to the pantry." I looked into her eyes. They were clear, blue, and utterly vacant of the woman I'd loved for 26 years. She wasn't looking at her husband. She was looking at an obstacle. "I forgot," I whispered. "It's okay," she said, patting my cheek. "That's why I'm here. I'll remember for you. Come on, let's get you upstairs. Mark is coming over for dinner. He wants to talk to you about signing some standard paperwork for the insurance company." Standard paperwork, another brick in my tomb. I let her lead me upstairs. I played the part of the broken, muddled old man. I leaned heavily on my cane. I let her help me into my chair. But inside, for the first time since the accident, the fog was gone. It was replaced by a cold, searing clarity. I wasn't just a man with a shattered leg. I was a builder, and I knew that when a structure is rotten at its core, you don't try to patch the walls. You tear it down to the ground. As I sat in the dining room that evening, watching Mark and Sarah exchange a quick, triumphant look over their wine glasses, I realized I was being watched. I looked up at the corner of the room, near the crown molding I'd installed myself. There, hidden behind a decorative leaf, was a tiny, unblinking red eye, a camera. They weren't just waiting for me to fail. They were recording it. Every stumble, every slurred word, every moment of confusion was being harvested for the judge. My own home had been turned into a laboratory where they were studying my demise. I took a sip of the water Sarah had poured for me. It tasted metallic. I set it down. "Everything okay, big brother?" Mark asked, leaning forward. He was wearing a watch I'd bought him for his 30th birthday. It glittered under the chandelier. "You look sharp today. Almost like your old self." "I'm just tired, Mark." I said, letting my head sag slightly. Everything is so loud. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. It's the recovery, darling. It takes time, but don't worry. We've taken care of everything. You don't have to think about a single thing ever again. I closed my eyes and nodded. I had been a fool. I had built a kingdom and handed the keys to the barbarians because they wore the faces of people I loved. But they forgot one thing. You don't spend 30 years in construction without learning how to handle a sledgehammer. They thought they were watching a man lose his mind. They didn't realize they were watching a man plan a demolition. The next morning, the sun didn't so much rise as it did bruise the sky, a dull, aching purple that mirrored the throbbing behind my temples. I sat at the kitchen table, the mahogany surface polished to a mirror shine, watching Sarah move through the kitchen. She was humming a soft tune, something light and airy, as she prepared my breakfast. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said, her voice a practiced melody of affection. She set a plate of poached eggs and dry toast in front of me, followed by the little plastic cup, 2 blue pills, 1 white one. "My clarity," she called them. "Drink up, honey. You want to be sharp for the day, don't you?" I looked at the cup. For months, I had swallowed these without question, believing my wife was the only thing standing between me and a total mental collapse. Now I saw them for what they were, chemical shackles. I picked up the glass of water, my hand trembling, half from the lingering tremors of the accident, half from the sheer effort of not wrapping my fingers around the throat of the woman I had once promised to protect. I put the pills in my mouth. I took a long, slow sip of water. I tilted my head back, making the exaggerated swallowing motion I'd perfected as a child to avoid bitter aspirin. But the pills were tucked neatly under my tongue, nestled against my lower gum. "Good boy," she whispered, leaning down to kiss my forehead. She smelled like expensive, lily-scented perfume and betrayal. As soon as she turned back to the sink, I wiped my mouth with a napkin, palming the pills and sliding them into the pocket of my robe. I did this every day for a week. By the 3rd day, the fog didn't just lift, it evaporated. The world came back in high definition. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the subtle shift in Sarah's tone when she talked to Mark on the phone in the other room. I wasn't a husband anymore. I was a ghost haunting my own house. Tell me in the comments, have you ever looked at someone you love and realized you were sleeping next to a stranger? Have you ever felt the cold chill of realizing your life was a stage and you were the only one who didn't know the script? I spent my days in the fog. I sat in my armchair by the window staring out at the garden, letting my jaw slacken just enough. I let my eyes wander, unfocused. I practiced the stare, the look of a man who was lost in his own living room. I knew that red eye in the corner was watching. I wanted it to see exactly what it was programmed to find, a broken king. But at night, when the house went dark and the steady rhythm of Sarah's breathing told me she was asleep, I became the architect of my own shadows. I had a secret. In every house I'd ever built, I'd installed something the owners didn't know about. A signature. In my own home, it was a hidden crawl space behind the built-in bookshelves in the library. It wasn't for gold or guns. It was for my private server, the one that mirrored every transaction of my construction firm. I'd built it years ago when I first started worrying about cybersecurity, never imagining the threat would come from the vice president's office. At 2 a.m., I slid the false panel open. The cool, stale air of the hidden room felt like a sanctuary. I fired up the monitor, the blue light reflecting in my glasses. What I found wasn't just embezzlement. It was a systematic dismantling. Mark had been funneling consulting fees to a shell company in Delaware for 18 months. The amounts started small, $5,000, $10,000. But since my accident, the numbers had exploded. He'd drained the payroll reserve. He'd delayed payments to our steel suppliers, blaming administrative errors caused by my supposed mental decline. The company was hemorrhaging and the vultures were circling. Mark was in talks with Vanguard Construction, my oldest rival, to sell our assets for 40 cents on the dollar. The deal included a severance package for the leadership, meaning Mark and Sarah would walk away with millions in offshore accounts, while the 300 families who worked for me would be out on the street by Christmas. I leaned back, my eyes burning, 30 years of sweat, 30 years of standing on girders in freezing rain, of missing birthdays and anniversaries to ensure my men had a paycheck and my family had a life. All of it was being sold for a severance package and a clean break. I needed an ally. But who can you trust when your own brother has turned? I thought of Silas. Silas was 70, retired, and had been my site foreman for 25 years. He was a man of few words and a moral compass made of tempered steel. He'd seen Mark grow up. He'd seen the greed in him before I ever did. I couldn't call him from the house. Every line was tapped. Every device was compromised. The next afternoon I told Sarah I wanted to sit in the garden. "The air will be good for my head," I slurred, leaning heavily on my cane. "Of course, darling. I'll bring you some tea in a bit." I sat on the stone bench, the autumn wind biting at my neck. When Sarah went into the kitchen to put the kettle on, I did something I hadn't done in years. I reached under the bench, into a hollowed-out stone I'd placed there during the landscaping. Inside was a burner phone I'd bought during a confused trip to the pharmacy 2 days prior. I dialed the number from memory. "Yeah?" A gravelly voice answered. "Silas, it's me." Silence. A long, heavy pause. I heard you weren't yourself, boss." "I've never been more myself, Silas. But I need you to listen, and I need you to be fast. I'm being held captive in my own skin." I told him everything. The safe, the blue pills, the petition, the Vanguard deal. I could hear Silas's breathing get heavy, the sound of a man who was ready to break some ribs. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need you to get to the county clerk's office. There's a clerk there named Mrs. Higgins. She owes me for that favor back in 14. I need the original signatures on the petition. And Silas, I need you to find where Mark is meeting the Vanguard reps. I need to know the time and the place. Consider it done. But boss, what about the lady?" I looked toward the house. Sarah was at the window watching me, a porcelain cup in her hand. She waved. A bright, cheerful gesture. I waved back with a trembling hand. "She's already made her choice, Silas," I whispered. "I'm just making sure she has to live with it." I hung up and tucked the phone back into the stone just as the back door creaked open. Dinner that night was an exercise in pure, cold-blooded theater. Mark came over, smelling of expensive bourbon and success. He sat across from me, his eyes darting to Sarah, then back to me. "So, big brother," he said, sliding a document across the table, "I've been looking at the Miller Heights project. With the accident and the delays, the bank is getting twitchy. We need to sign over the emergency operating authority to me, just until you're back on your feet. It's a formality, keeps the inspectors off our backs." I looked at the paper. It was a power of attorney. If I signed this, the petition for guardianship wouldn't even matter. He could sell the company tonight and have me moved to a care facility by morning. Sarah leaned in, her hand resting on my arm. "It's for the best, honey. You've worked so hard. Don't you want to just let go? Let us handle the stress? We love you so much." I looked at the pen in Mark's hand. I looked at the red eye of the camera in the corner. I don't know," I said, my voice wavering. I let a bit of saliva pool at the corner of my mouth. I saw the flash of disgust in Mark's eyes, a split second where his contempt overrode his greed. Is it a lot of money?" "It's about safety, Rick," Mark said, his voice dripping with false patience. "Just sign here. The X next to the blue tab." I picked up the pen. My hand shook violently. I hovered it over the signature line. I could feel their hearts racing. I could feel the greed in the room like a physical weight. Then I accidentally knocked over my glass of red wine. The dark liquid blossomed across the white linen, soaking into the power of attorney form, turning the legal jargon into a purple, illegible mess. Oh no!" I cried out, my voice high and frantic. I started dabbing at the table with my napkin, making it worse, smearing the ink, creating a chaotic scene. "I'm sorry, Mark. I'm so sorry. I'm so clumsy." Mark jumped back to save his suit, swearing under his breath. Sarah's face contorted into a mask of pure rage for a heartbeat before she forced the nurturing smile back on. It's okay, she said, her voice tight. "It's just paper. We can print another one." "I need to lie down," I moaned, clutching my head. "The lights, they're too bright." I let her lead me to the bedroom. I let her tuck me in. I let her think I was a pathetic, ruined man who couldn't even sign his own name. But as the door clicked shut and I heard them whispering in the hallway, Mark calling me a senile old bastard, and Sarah telling him to be patient, it's almost over. I sat up in the dark. The wine hadn't been an accident. It was a test. I wanted to see how far they'd go, and I wanted to buy Silas one more day. That night, I went back to the crawl space. Silas had sent a file to the server. He'd found it. Mark wasn't just selling the company. He was selling the land our father had left us, the original site of the first gas station, the place where we'd buried our old dog, the place I had sworn would stay in the Dalton name forever. Mark was selling it to a developer who wanted to turn it into a strip mall, and the meeting was tomorrow, 4 p.m. at the Des Moines Athletic Club. I looked at the documents on the screen. I saw the shell companies, the forged signatures, the quiet cruelty of their plan. They thought they were building a future on my grave. They didn't realize that in my world, when a foundation is faulty, you don't just walk away. You wait until they're all inside the building. Then you pull the pins. I spent the rest of the night drafting my own power of attorney, not to Mark, to Silas, and I drafted a letter to the board of directors, one that would be delivered by a process server at exactly 4:05 p.m. the next day. I looked at the red camera light in the corner of my study. "Are you watching?" I whispered into the darkness. "I hope you're recording this part, because this is the part where the ghost starts fighting back." I went back to bed and slept for the first time in weeks. I didn't toss. I didn't turn. I slept with the cold, heavy peace of a man who knows exactly how much TNT it takes to level a limestone mansion. The demolition was scheduled, and I wouldn't be wearing a hard hat. The morning of the meeting, the sky was the color of a galvanized steel bucket, heavy, gray, and ready to spill. I sat in my usual chair, the one that faced the window, watching the rain streak the glass like tears on a face that had forgotten how to cry. Sarah was behind me, her hands on my shoulders. She was massaging the tight muscles of my neck, her touch light and delicate. To anyone watching through that hidden red eye in the corner, it looked like a scene of pure domestic devotion. A wife caring for her broken husband. "You look so handsome in this suit, honey," she whispered in my ear. "It's been so long since you dressed up. Mark is so proud to have you there today. It shows the board that the Dalton name is still at the helm, even if you're just observing." I let my head tilt forward, my chin almost touching my chest. "The board," I slurred, making sure to let a bit of a tremor shake my voice. Are they the ones with the hammers?" I felt her fingers stiffen for a fraction of a second before she resumed the massage. "No, darling. No hammers today. Just pens. Remember what we practiced? You just smile, you nod, and you let Mark handle the talking. If anyone asks how you feel, what do you say?" I say, "I'm resting. I'm resting in the light," I droned, repeating the nonsense phrase I'd been using to simulate a fractured mind. "Perfect," she said, giving my shoulders a final, possessive squeeze. "Before we continue with what happened in that boardroom, please take a moment to tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Your support gives me the strength to tell these truths." Mark arrived at 3:30 p.m. in a sleek black sedan. He was wearing a three-piece suit that probably cost more than the first 3 trucks I ever owned. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and barely concealed triumph. He helped me into the back seat of the car, his movements brisk and efficient, like he was loading a piece of heavy equipment that was past its warranty. The Des Moines Athletic Club is a place of mahogany, leather, and the hushed tones of important men. I'd been a member for 20 years, but today, as I limped through the lobby, leaning heavily on my cane, the staff looked at me differently. There was a softness in their eyes, the kind you reserve for a dog that needs to be put down. Mark loved it. He played the part of the grieving, burdened brother to perfection, nodding somberly to the concierge, his hand never leaving my elbow. We were led to the founder's room. It was a room I had helped renovate 10 years ago. I knew every joint in the paneling, every wire in the ceiling. As we entered, the air was thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and cold ambition. The board of directors, men I had played golf with, men I had helped build their own fortunes, sat around the long table. Across from them sat the representatives from Vanguard Construction. They were younger, sharper, and they looked at me like I was a pile of scrap metal. Mark sat me at the head of the table, the honorary seat. "Thank you all for coming," Mark began, his voice projected with the confidence of a man who had already spent the money. "As you know, my brother's health has been a primary concern for all of us. The accident at Miller Heights was a tragedy, one that has left a void in the leadership of Dalton Construction." He paused, glancing at me with a performative sigh. I sat there, my mouth slightly open, staring at a brass water pitcher like it held the secrets of the universe. "In light of Rick's ongoing cognitive challenges," Mark continued, "and the mounting pressure from our creditors, the executive team has decided that the most responsible path forward is a strategic merger with Vanguard. This will ensure the legacy of the Dalton name while providing Rick with the lifelong care he clearly requires." One of the board members, an old friend named Dave, looked at me, his brow furrowed. "Rick, do you understand what's happening here? Mark says you've reviewed the merger documents." I turned my head slowly, my eyes unfocused. "The birds," I whispered. "The birds are in the rafters, Dave. They're building nests out of the blueprints." A heavy silence fell over the room. Dave looked away, his face etched with genuine grief. Mark cleared his throat, his eyes flashing with a predatory glint. "As you can see," Mark said, sliding a thick stack of papers toward the Vanguard reps, "my brother is no longer in a position to manage the complexities of a firm this size. I have the petition for guardianship here, along with the temporary operating authority. We just need the board's final vote to ratify the asset sale." "Wait," I said. The word wasn't loud, it wasn't slurred. It was a sharp, cold snap of a dry branch in a silent forest. Mark froze. The Vanguard reps paused their pens. Every head in the room swiveled toward the head of the table. I didn't move my head, I didn't change my posture, but I let the fog vanish from my eyes. I let 30 years of command, 30 years of being the man who said yes or no to the fate of millions, flood back into my gaze. "Rick," Mark stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Brother, you should sit back. The light is bothering you again." I stood up. I didn't use the cane. I leaned forward, my scarred oak bark hands flat on the mahogany table. I felt the power of the room shift, flowing toward me like a tide returning to the shore. "The light isn't bothering me, Mark," I said, my voice echoing off the walls I had built. "The only thing bothering me is the stench of the rot in this room." I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside were 12 blue pills and 6 white ones. Every dose Sarah had tried to feed me over the last week. I tossed them onto the table. They clattered like tiny, frozen raindrops. "My wife has been drugging me with a cocktail of benzodiazepines and sedatives," I said, looking directly at the Vanguard CEO. "And my brother has been using my temporary absence to funnel nearly $2 million into a shell company called Blue Bridge Holdings in Delaware." "Mark, did you really think I wouldn't notice the payroll taxes weren't being filed?" Mark tried to stand, but his knees seemed to have turned to water. This is a delusion. It's the trauma. Dave, call the paramedics. He's having a breakdown." "Sit down, Mark," I barked. The sheer volume of my voice, the old sight foreman roar, made him drop back into his chair as if he'd been struck. I turned to the board. "For the last 14 days, I've been playing a role. I needed to see how deep the rot went. I needed to know who was holding the shovel and who was just standing by, watching the hole get deeper." I pulled a small remote from my pocket and pressed a button. The large monitor at the end of the room flickered to life. It wasn't a spreadsheet, it was a video feed. It was the view from the red eye in my study. It showed Mark and Sarah 3 nights ago sitting at my desk. Mark was laughing, holding a bottle of my best scotch. "How long until the hearing?" Sarah's voice came through the speakers, crystal clear. 3 weeks, Mark replied. "Once the judge signs the papers, we move him to the Havenwood facility. It's private, high security. He won't be able to call a lawyer, let alone a site foreman. And the Vanguard money? First 10 million hits the Cayman account 48 hours after the sale. We'll be in Cabo by Christmas, Sarah. Let the old man stare at the walls in Havenwood. He built them. He might as well enjoy the view." The room was so silent you could hear the rain hitting the window 4 floors up. Sarah's voice, the woman they all knew as a pillar of the community, sounded like a serrated blade. I turned the screen off. "Mark," I said, leaning over him until I could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath, the same bourbon he'd been stealing from my cellar. "You told Vanguard that Dalton Construction was a distressed asset. You told them our accounts were empty, and you were right. They are empty, because this morning at 8 a.m. I exercised my emergency founder's clause." I looked at the Vanguard CEO. He looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. "Every contract, every piece of heavy equipment, and every cent of the company's operating capital has been moved into a private trust," I said. "The trust is managed by Silas Thorne, my former foreman, and a legal team that doesn't work for you. Dalton Construction is no longer for sale. In fact, Dalton Construction doesn't exist anymore." Mark's mouth worked, but no sound came out. "What remains of the original corporate entity," I continued, "are the debts. The lawsuits from the Miller Heights accident, which, by the way, I've discovered was caused by substandard steel you authorized to save a buck, Mark, and the back taxes for the Delaware Shell Company. As vice president and acting CEO, those liabilities are now yours, personally." Mark's face went from gray to white to a terrifying shade of blue. You destroyed it. You destroyed everything we built." "No," I said, picking up my cane. "Not because I needed it, but because I liked the weight of it. I demolished a condemned building. You were the ones living inside it." At that moment, the double doors of the founder's room opened. 2 men in suits walked in, followed by Silas. Silas looked at me and gave a short, sharp nod. The men weren't paramedics. They were from the State Police Financial Crimes Division. "Mark Dalton?" the lead officer asked. "You're under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit aggravated assault via chemical restraint." As they pulled Mark from his chair and began to cuff him, he started to scream. He screamed about family. He screamed about how I was always the favorite. He screamed until they led him out of the room, and his voice faded into the carpeted hallways of the club. I turned to the board. Most of them wouldn't look me in the eye. Dave did. He looked ashamed. "Rick," he said, "we didn't know. We thought." "That's the problem, Dave," I said, straightening my tie. "You thought, but you didn't look. You saw a man with a limp, and you assumed his mind was as broken as his leg. You forgot that I'm the one who poured the foundation of this city, and I never pour a foundation without a backup plan." I walked out of the room. I didn't look back at the Vanguard reps. I didn't look back at the board. I had one more stop to make. I drove back to the house in West Des Moines. The rain had turned into a steady, rhythmic thrumming. I walked through the front door. The house was quiet. Too quiet. "Sarah?" I called out. My voice was calm, steady. She came down the stairs wearing a silk robe, a glass of wine in her hand. She hadn't heard yet. She thought I was still her good boy. "You're back early, darling," she said, a bright false smile on her face. "How did the meeting go? Did you make Mark proud?" I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up the little plastic cup she'd left there for my evening dose. I held it up to the light. "The meeting was enlightening, Sarah," I said. "We talked about foundations, we talked about Cabo, and we talked about Havenwood." The glass of wine slipped from her fingers. It shattered on the marble floor, the red liquid spreading like a bloodstain. The mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. "Rick," she whispered, her voice trembling. I can explain. Mark, he pressured me. He said we were losing everything. I did it to protect you, to protect me," I repeated, walking toward her. I didn't stop until I was inches from her face. I could see the tiny lines of greed and fear around her eyes. "You didn't protect me, Sarah. You tried to erase me. You sat in this house, in the rooms I built for you, and you plotted to turn my brain into mush so you could buy a new aesthetic." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is a restraining order," I said, "and this is a petition for divorce. You have 10 minutes to get whatever fits in one suitcase. The locks are being changed as we speak. The cars are being towed. And the bank accounts, they've been frozen for investigation." "You can't do this," she shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that set my teeth on edge. "I'm your wife. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," I said, nodding toward the front door. Two police cars pulled into the driveway, their blue and red lights reflecting off the limestone walls, turning the house into something that looked like a crime scene, because that's exactly what it was. Sarah started to wail, a loud, ugly sound that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with losing her status. She was led out in her silk robe, her bare feet hitting the wet pavement, as they put her in the back of the car. I stood in the doorway and watched them drive away. The house was empty. The company was in a trust. My brother was in a cell, and my wife was a memory. I walked back into the kitchen. I picked up the little plastic cup and threw it into the trash. Then I sat down at the head of the table. I sat in the silence. I sat in the truth. But as I looked at the empty chairs, I realized that the demolition wasn't over. Clearing the site is only the first step. Now I had to figure out if there was anything left worth building on. The silence of a 30-room mansion is different from the silence of a home. A home breathes with you. A mansion just echoes your footsteps, reminding you of how much space you're occupying alone. After the police cars had disappeared down the winding driveway, and the blue and red lights stopped pulsing against the limestone wall, I sat in the dark for a long time. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't pour a drink. I just listened to the house. It felt like a hollow shell. For years, I had thought I was building a sanctuary, a monument to my success. Now I realized I had built a museum of my own blindness. Every expensive painting, every Italian marble tile, every custom-made piece of furniture was a witness to the two people who had sat in this room and prayed for my mind to rot. Before I tell you how the final pieces of the foundation settled, please take a moment to tell me in the comments, have you ever had to walk away from everything you built to save your soul? I read every one of your stories, and they remind me that I am not alone. The next few months were a blur of cold rooms and sharp-edged legal documents. The fog was gone, but the clarity that replaced it was heavy. Mark's trial for corporate fraud and conspiracy was the lead story in the local papers for weeks. The Construction King and the Prodigal Brother, the headlines called it. I attended every hearing. I sat in the front row, my back straight, my cane resting against my leg. I wanted Mark to see me. I wanted him to look into the eyes he thought would be vacant by now. He never did. He sat at the defense table, his expensive suit looking wrinkled, his shoulders hunched. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate rat-like twitching. His lawyers tried every trick in the book. They tried to blame the pressure of the company. They tried to claim that Sarah was the mastermind and Mark was just a concerned brother caught in her web. They even tried to argue that the video evidence was obtained illegally, but the judge didn't buy it, especially not when Silas stood on the stand. Silas, in his best Sunday suit, his voice as steady as a plumb line, described the substandard steel Mark had ordered. He described the consulting fees that Mark had tried to hide. And finally, he described the way I had looked when I was drugged, the man he had respected for 25 years reduced to a shadow. When the verdict came in, guilty on all counts, I didn't feel a surge of joy. I felt a grim, quiet relief. Mark was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. As they led him away in chains, he finally looked at me. There was no apology in his eyes, only a deep, burning resentment. It was the look of a man who still believed the world owed him a seat at a table he hadn't built. Sarah's fate was a different kind of slow-motion wreck. The divorce was ugly, but truth is a powerful disinfectant in a courtroom. Because of the evidence of the drugging and her participation in the conspiracy, the ironclad prenuptial agreement she had spent years refining was tossed out. She didn't get the half of the company she'd been eyeing. She didn't get the millions in the offshore accounts. Those had been seized as part of the criminal investigation. She was left with the house in West Des Moines, but I had ensured that the house was no prize. I had refinanced it to the hilt months before to cover the debts Mark had created. The mortgage payments were $50,000 a month. Without my income, without the company's capital, and with her reputation in tatters, she was drowning. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she tried to sell the furniture, the aesthetic she loved so much, But the luxury market in Des Moines is small, and everyone knew the story. Nobody wanted the chairs where a woman had plotted her husband's demise. One evening, about 6 months after the trial, I drove past the old house. There was a foreclosure sign on the manicured lawn. The limestone was streaked with gray from the rain, and the gardens were overgrown. Sarah was gone, moved into a small apartment on the south side of town, living on the meager remains of a trust fund her father had left her, a fund I had once helped replenish. I didn't stop the car. I kept driving until I reached the north side, near the old industrial district. This is where the real work began. I had dissolved the original Dalton construction, but I hadn't destroyed the spirit of it. I used the private trust I'd created to form a new entity, Thorne and Dalton. I made Silas a full partner. We didn't want the skyscrapers anymore. We didn't want the charity galas. We went back to the roots. Small-scale residential development for working families, high-quality, affordable homes built by men who were paid a fair wage and treated with respect. I spent my days on the sites. I traded my silk ties for denim shirts and my mahogany desk for a plywood table in a trailer. The limp was still there, and some days the headaches returned, but my mind was sharp. I was building again, and this time I was pouring the concrete with people I could trust. I moved out of the city. I bought a small 2-bedroom cottage on 30 acres of wooded land near the river. It was the kind of place my father would have liked. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, not limestone and ego. One Saturday afternoon, I was out in the small garage I'd built, sharpening my chisels. The sound of the whetstone was rhythmic, a soothing shh. A car pulled up the gravel driveway. I stood up, wiping my hands on a rag, my heart tightening. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was Sarah. She looked older, much older. Her hair, which used to be perfectly coiffed, was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was wearing a coat that looked a few years out of style. She stood at the edge of the garage, looking at me, her hands trembling. "Rick," she said. Her voice was thin, stripped of the velvet. "Sarah," I said. I didn't move toward her. I stayed behind my workbench. It was my barrier, my foundation. I just wanted to see if you were okay," she lied. We both knew why she was here. She was out of money. The Cabo dream was dead, and the reality of a South Side apartment was sinking in. "I'm better than I've been in years, Sarah," I said. "The fog is gone." She looked around the garage, at the old tools, the sawdust on the floor, the rusted truck parked in the corner. "You're living like this? After everything? You could have had it all, Rick. We could have fixed it. We couldn't fix a structure that was built on a lie, Sarah," I said, setting the chisel down. "A house can stand a lot of things. It can stand a storm, it can stand a flood, it can even stand a fire. Но оно не выдержит, если фундамент сделан из песка и предательства." "I loved you," she whispered, a tear finally tracking down her cheek. "In my own way, I did. Love without respect is just a hostage situation, Sarah," I replied, "and I've finally been released." She stood there for a long moment, waiting for me to offer her something, a check, a seat at the table, a way back into the warmth. I just picked up the chisel and went back to work. "Shh." She turned and walked back to her car. I watched the dust from her tires settle on the gravel. I didn't feel a sting of regret. I didn't feel a pull of nostalgia. I just felt the weight of the steel in my hand. That night I sat on my porch, watching the sun dip below the tree line. The river was high, the water rushing over the rocks with a steady, powerful sound. I realized then that my life hadn't been destroyed. It had been renovated. Sometimes the only way to see the true strength of a man is to strip away the marble and the limestone until there's nothing left but the bone. Mark is in a cell, learning the true value of time. Sarah is in a world that no longer cares about her aesthetic, and I am here, in the quiet, building things that are meant to last. If you're listening to this and you feel like your world is collapsing, if you feel the people you love digging your grave, don't be afraid of the demolition. It hurts to lose the walls you thought protected you. It's terrifying to stand in the rubble of your own life. But remember this, you are the architect. You survived the fall. You cleared the site, and as long as you have your tools and your truth, you can always build something better. Your dignity doesn't need to shout. Justice isn't always a gavel in a courtroom. Sometimes it's just the peace of a small house and a mind that finally belongs to you. Thank you for standing with me through this journey. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe. We are a community built on the truth, and there is always a seat for you at our table. Take care of yourselves, and remember, always check the foundation.